A push to make it easier to get a suspended license lifted as the state tackles what some call an epidemic. Plus, a new multi-billion-dollar plan to keep Kansas roads safe for the next decade. And the fight over a constitutional amendment on abortion pits it against Medicaid expansion and has Republicans squaring off with Republicans this week. That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week. This is Kansas Week, and I'm your host, Pilar Pedraza. The halt in work on Medicaid expansion this week has angered Kansans who support the Denning-Kelly compromise plan. Thursday to voice their concerns and demand a clean bill now. Among the speakers, Republican Senator Randall Hardy from Salina, who promised he wouldn't vote for any budget bill until Medicaid expansion has passed, upping the ante in the ongoing fight. Senate President Susan Wagle has said the holdup is about whether Medicaid funds would be used to pay for abortions in Kansas if a constitutional amendment doesn't pass. But as Corinne Griffith from KSN's Capitol Bureau shows us, other senators on both sides of the aisle think she's got another reason for the fight.
Each day there's something new. Lawmakers trading jabs over abortion rights and Medicaid. And in the meantime, both bills are at a standstill. It all started when a possible constitutional amendment on abortion failed to pass through the Kansas House. Senate President Susan Wagle announced that she will not allow Medicaid expansion to be debated in the Senate despite its bipartisan support. Wagle is running for the U.S. Senate, and some say she's holding Medicaid expansion hostage in order to get her way. For the first time, Senator Wagle is answering our questions on camera, and she's now blaming Democratic Governor Laura Kelly.
It's actually Governor Kelly versus Susan Wagle.
Wagle alleges the governor used threats and scare tactics to sway votes and block the abortion amendment from passing.
She inserted herself in this process. She's quite angry. She wants Medicaid expansion.
I tracked down Governor Kelly to get her take.
I understand that there are those who use those bullying tactics to get things done. That's never been my style. It's still not my style.
Wagle says passing Medicaid expansion without the abortion amendment, which would give the legislature power to regulate abortions, would mean taxpayers would pay for Medicaid abortions. However, rivals say this is not true.
It's a bogus issue to think that taxpayers are going to be paying for abortions if Medicaid is expanded. It's really trying to trump up an issue just to put fear in people.
Wagle says she has received support from Kansans, even those who would benefit from Medicaid expansion.
They're okay with us holding on Medicaid expansion until we pick up a few more votes for that constitutional amendment so the people of Kansas can vote.
We will keep an eye on this debate. At the Capitol, I'm Corinne Griffith.
And joining me on the desk this week to discuss this and more, we have State Representative Stephen Owens, Republican from Heston, Dr. Russell Arbin Fox, political scientist from Friends University, and State Representative Tim Hodge, Democrat from Newton. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So this has kind of been a big issue that has overshadowed a lot of other pretty big issues this session. I'm going to start with our lawmakers here. Has there been any movement? Stephen, let's start with you.
I don't know. Without a doubt, our party and the House, I'm incredibly disappointed that didn't pass. Look, we missed the opportunity that hopefully isn't totally gone to get something passed to the Kansans, to the citizens, to be able to make their voice heard. There's plenty of excuses why not, should have been November, should have had this wording. Regardless, let the people decide. And it's an absolute disappointment that there were 4 so-called Republicans who didn't stand for life that day. What Wagle doing, what she's not doing, she's put the brakes on some things, because if, like in Connecticut, we run the chance that 75% of abortions are paid by Medicaid, then by gosh, we need to deal with this life amendment, and we need to deal with it now.
All right. Tim?
Well, it's interesting to see the entire process get stopped just because somebody's federal and failing Senate campaign is in trouble. It's unfortunate because there's a lot of good ideas percolating and circulating in the Capitol that need to be heard, but we're at a standstill for about 2 weeks now over this issue, and I find it difficult to see when someone claim to be pro-life, but yet keep 150,000 Kansans from getting health insurance that they desperately need. I mean, you can be anti-abortion and want to ban all abortions. I get that, but it's not consistent to be pro-life in that same sentence.
And Russell, you and I talked a little bit earlier in the week about this. How common is a maneuver like this?
Pulling legislation, forcing it back into committee, bottling it up, is a good way to apply pressure in a very pointed and specific way when you've got a few legislators that you want to target. The idea of pulling legislation and sending it back to committee when you're dealing with something that apparently has majority support is much more unusual and much riskier. The move that Senator Wagle is taking here is one that could easily backfire on her, politically speaking.
I got one more question, and I know it's a little unfair. I'm going to end here with Stephen, but I know there's been a lot of talk about November versus August. Would Republicans be willing to accept an amendment to move the abortion bill to a November vote instead of August?
Here's the issue with November versus August. We're talking about up to 15 to 30 babies a day that are killed. As the court processes go through, as the challenges that are already filed go through and make it through that process, every voter has the opportunity to vote in August if they choose to get out and vote in August. But that saves the potential for things to get past the process and the ability to continue to save lives so that we don't go back to the Dr. Tiller days of dismemberment abortions and late-term abortions. It needs to happen as soon as possible.
I can tell Tim wants to speak up.
Thank you. This amendment could have been put on the city and county ballot the city school board ballot back in 2019. This argument of babies are dying every day, if that was so important, it should have been done last election. And this decision was in April of 19. We didn't end sine die until May of 19. It could have been done at that time. And the argument of putting it on the ballot for August, and they say let them vote, they should put it on a ballot when people actually are participating in elections. So I find that pretty disingenuous, frankly.
Do they not all have the opportunity
they have
to
the
vote in
opportunity,
August?
But
and
we,
to
as
be
we
there
know,
and to be engaged?
People don't have the luxury of politics all the time. It's difficult to make it to elections all the time.
Two times to vote a
Yeah,
year. I'm
exactly.
sure we can find the
People are
time for
working
something
two
as
jobs
important as this.
and it's
Advanced
busy,
ballots.
It's a busy
Okay,
time.
this is
Advanced
a debate
ballots,
that's been
mail-in
going on
ballots.
for years. We're not going to end it right here.
Thank you.
So we are going to end it right here and move on to our next topic. Soaring property taxes have led to public worries that the cost is pushing people out of Kansas and calls for reforms. But one of the first efforts at making the property tax rates more transparent is getting a chilly reception from cities and counties across Kansas. Senate Bill 294, dubbed the Truth in Taxation Bill, would require cities that get more than $5,000 from property taxes a year to send notices of estimated property tax increases. It's based on a long-standing Utah law. While it has the support of groups like the Farm Bureau, the Kansas Chamber, and Kansas Association of Realtors, city and county officials across the state oppose it, saying it would hamstring the ability of local agencies to create jobs and would erode local control. Others say it's just too complex and would result in the opposite of transparency, in part because it would put no limits on what the state could actually collect. This week, the Senate Tax Committee removed school districts from the groups covered in the bill and removed the tax lid for city and county governments. The bill now moves on to the full Senate for debate. So really kind of some complicated legislation there, but the idea is to let people have a better idea of what to expect from their tax bills. Is it sufficient? Is it going to do what it's designed to do, Tim?
I think it will have an effect of informing the population as to why their property taxes are going up. Again, back in 2012, when income taxes were cut for corporations and business owners, this really shifted the onus of all local services to counties, to cities, to school districts. The money that they were getting from Topeka back then was now shifted to the local government units. And so that's why you have skyrocketing property taxes. Every fee's going up, utilities are going up, water bills are going up. And so counties are looking for every place they can find to grab cash. And then on top of that, they'll add these economic development projects that don't really pan out. Newton is a prime example. We got a $6.5 million building sitting empty because of a a deal that would not go through and it wasn't taken care of. Now we're on the hook and we gotta sell it for pennies on the dollar. And the people that have been living in my town for 50 years, they're the ones stuck with the bill. And Newton's not alone in that phenomenon. So these cities and counties have to rein in their spending and use our dollars properly.
Stephen?
Yeah, I think there's absolutely no doubt that spending is key, and the cap that was put in place because people on a fixed income struggle to deal with increase in property taxes, right? I hear from people on a regular basis who struggle to pay their property taxes. And so when the tax lid was put in place, the idea is here's a mechanism by which we can offer some assurance to people. I wasn't there when that vote happened. Now we look back and we see, okay, maybe that wasn't the best way. Let's look at this other option. Let's look at an option that says, okay, let's make sure everybody knows what to expect when their taxes are going to go and have input in that. I think it's worth looking at. Do I 100% support it? I can't say that yet, but I definitely want to continue to explore it.
Russell, how common is it for cities and counties to not like bills that might curtail what they can collect in taxes?
Well, it's a very practical political concern. I mean, let me speak up a moment here for some cities and counties in Kansas. Everybody here knows that one of the things that will happen when there is a mandated requirement for public hearings is you're going to allow more time for opposition to organize, frequently around extremely minor issues. You give people platforms, they use those platforms in order to build up arguments, and it's possible that those arguments might, in a normal election, sway enough people to really change policy. But if you're going to require these additional levels of organization and these additional levels of action for every proposal that is being made by a duly elected county or city body, then you're making their job harder.
So yes or no, does this property tax bill have a future in the legislature, Stephen?
I would think that it does. I think it warrants more conversation, and I think it's going to be an ongoing conversation, and I hope that it makes it to where we can further debate it.
Tim?
It has this aspect that counties and cities like, which is to get rid of the property tax lid, but then it makes them publish what they're going to spend money on. So
of course, it's already being published. You're requiring them to have additional public hearings about all
that's
these
my
matters.
point. They're adding more steps to it, and so I don't know. I'm sorry.
It at least gets mailed to people's house, because the things that are currently published in the newspaper that very few people get, this would at least require it to go to their mailbox.
And that's a fair point.
And whether or not we need to change the newspaper requirement in publishing public information is a discussion for a whole nother day.
Whole nother day.
That's a whole episode.
It certainly is. Certainly is.
All right. Well, moving on.
Don't
It's
mention
that
McClatchy.
time of decade again when the state has to map out the future of its roads and highways. The governor unveiled the $9.9 billion 10-year plan this week. Alec Gartner from the KSN Capitol Bureau breaks it down for us.
It's called Forward. Governor Laura Kelly and Transportation Secretary Julie Lorenz are unveiling a new 10-year transportation plan. Kelly says having an updated plan is important to getting people to want to live here.
We must maintain our advantage of having some of the shortest commute times in the country. With Forward, we'll give Kansans more time to do the things they want rather than wasting their time in traffic jams.
The plan is projected to cost $9.9 billion. But in order to pay for the plan, Kelly says the state has to get away from taking transportation money and using it on something else. Governor Kelly says there won't be a need for a tax increase if funding for KDOT stays with KDOT. Officials say if the plan is passed, your drive could be smoother.
There's an increased focus on preservation and maintenance. After that, what you'll see are strategic investments in some priority corridors. More importantly, we've created several smaller programs that communities can access year in and year out so we can get more targeted improvements for communities faster.
KDOT has held 27 meetings across the state to get feedback on the state's biggest needs. Now the plan will head to the legislature for debate. Reporting at the Capitol, I'm Alec Gartner.
And certainly transportation, I know there is an interim task force, lots of hard work that went into this plan. What's the next step, Tim?
Well, I'm proud to be part of the legislature that restored funding for these programs, and that was a big first step so that these projects could even be possible. I know we still have a lot to do as far as transportation goes. I mean, you got to stretch between Heston and Mountain Ridge that I don't know if you have teeth left after you drive it. So I think those are good jobs. They're good paying jobs. They're in Kansas. You don't have our transportation contractors going to Oklahoma or other states and having their families split apart for those times. So yeah, we need to keep funding our transportation program, keep funding T-Works, follow the recommendation of our engineers, not put our politics into that decision, and just follow through with the funding.
And I think Senator McGinn's doing a great job leading the charge on this new transportation plan, the move forward. The thing that I would say is you're absolutely right. The funding is starting to go back towards roads, yet we're still taking hundreds of millions of dollars out of the governor's budget this year to fund them. And we cannot and absolutely cannot fund roads at the expense of capers, which is kind of the flip side that we want to, quit robbing the bank of KDOT and rob the bank of capers to make up the difference. Okay, that's not the right answer. This forward road plan, evaluating that every 2 years, brilliant, because there's a project up in Newton that was on the T-Works plan that's now not even necessary, so it's not going to happen. So yeah, I like this plan moving forward.
Russell, he kind of beat me to the Bank of KDOT versus Bank of Capers comment there, but certainly something that's been mentioned a lot as we talk about the transportation plan.
Sure. I mean,
is that really an either-or situation?
Well, I mean, it's not entirely, I think, because Capers is always going to find more people who will more readily make noise in protection of it than KDOT, and that's unfortunate. One of the great things about this plan, which I have some concern about, obviously, but one of the great things about it is that it is showing the governor paying direct attention to KDOT and putting forward ideas to try to create plans that will be sustainable over the long haul, and that gets people invested in following through on particular plans, and that means that there are people that are going to be a lot more likely to notice somebody taking money from KDOT and stand up and make noise about it. I would want to emphasize, generally speaking, that any change to the policies of KDOT that at least arguably will allow local municipalities and counties to make small improvement decisions is very, very important and very crucial for creating a more sustainable transportation future. I dislike the way the governor introduced it, emphasizing this idea that in Kansas it's all about short commute times or something like that. I mean, that's the sort of thing that plays into the minds of people who are going to complain, like you hear here in Wichita, when traffic slows them down maybe an average of a minute to 2 minutes, and yet they say, well, we've got to do something about this congestion. The more focus on local decisions in regards to specific transportation needs is better than these big overarching goals.
All right.
I want to make one more last
quickly.
comment. We have the Bank of Capers and KDOT. Just remember, I want to remind everyone, in 15, 16, both those banks were getting rated every year. And so now we're at a point where we don't have to do that anymore. So
okay, I'm going to let you have the last word there because we've got 2 more things to talk about still. Kansas lawmakers heard from you about a second bill this week that would change how the state deals with suspended driver's licenses, something some call an epidemic in Kansas. I was there and shared this report on Cake News.
So I can't go do simple things like run to the grocery store. I can't go and take my kids anywhere. I can't take the company vehicle and leave and go do things.
We introduced you to Daniel Lawrence last year. He's one of more than 200,000 Kansans with a suspended driver's license. He relies on his wife to get to work, but others don't always have that luxury.
It's very difficult. A lot of people, particularly in Wichita, our buses only run from 6 to 6.
Which is why Representative Gail Finney says more than 80% of Kansans with suspended driver's licenses give up and drive anyway. She hopes the changes in this bill will help. They would get rid of the application fee for a temporary restricted driver's license while the person is paying off their fines and fees. It would also shorten the additional time penalty for being caught driving on a suspended license from 90 to 30 days and would cut the cost of getting the license back once that sentence is served.
We feel that this is only the tip of the iceberg and very much
the tip.
Supporters say this would not only help get more legal and insured drivers on the road, keeping you safer, it would help empty the state's prisons. For many former convicts, the biggest barrier to getting a job and staying out of prison is a lack of driver's license.
In fact, one of the employers that we have that signed up to take on returning citizens is so desperate for workers right now that they will pay for Ubers.
Fewer people going back to prison means lower costs for the state and potentially lower taxes for you. No one opposed the bill.
This is my 12th year. Been working on these bills for a long time, and I think it's going to make a tremendous difference in people's lives once we get this problem started. Let me get it resolved.
And Stephen, I know you're on that committee, so I'm going to start with you. This is the result of a lot of work that the Criminal Justice Reform Committee has done.
Absolutely, yeah. Criminal Justice Reform Committee, an 18-month committee that started this past August. Very proud to sit on that committee with Gail Finney, Representative Finney, and the work that she is doing. I didn't know until that committee that better than 50% of the people that get out of prison have a suspended driver's license. The number one thing that makes recidivism go through the roof is their inability to get a job and to work. I strongly support these reforms because once you've paid your debt to society, we should make it much easier for you to reintegrate back into the workforce.
Hey, Tim, is this something that folks outside of the committee have started talking about yet?
Oh, sure. These are situations where people are unable to pay fines. They move and don't get notice of a fine, and so they don't get notice of a driving while suspended situation that happens. I mean, this is something that, and of course the fees snowball and become bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's definitely something we need to look at as far when the warrants come out and those types of things are in play, and then they have to pay a bondsman to get out of jail. It's just about trying to get these folks able to pay these fees off instead of bondsmen and higher insurance and all these other things just for a simple mistake.
I know that this has kind of been a nationwide movement to change some of these rules.
I mean, I have nothing but praise for the sort of work that the legislature is doing on this, and Steve and Tim are both exactly right. Nationally, particularly over maybe the last 10 or 15 years or so, many more people have become aware of how these small fines, these small rules are really exacerbating overall criminal justice problems. And that, frankly, oftentimes there are terribly unequal racial consequences for all of these. So addressing this, taking care of this is going to be a wonderful step forward.
Well, and there is now a third bill dealing with this topic that will have a hearing next week. HB 2434 would eliminate the practice of suspending licenses in Kansas for unpaid fines and fees. Suspensions for things like DUIs and vehicular homicide would remain in place. Activist groups across the state are providing transportation to the hearing on Tuesday afternoon and collecting written testimony from those who can't make it to Topeka. The deadline to sign up is noon on Monday. You can find more information at www.racialprofilingwichitaks.com. Look for the HB 2434 tab. Now, about 150 people showed up in Topeka last week, more than 200 sharing their concerns in written and oral testimony about the state's regulations on vaccines for school and daycare, and proposal to change all of those regulations. We go back to KSN's Corinne Griffith for the details.
Vaccines have become a divisive issue over the last few years. Now, one Kansas lawmaker wants to give the legislature input into the vaccine requirements for school students. Currently, vaccination requirements are decided on by the Secretary of the Kansas Department of Health and Environment and Rules and Regulations. But Representative Hubert says that's not enough.
I do believe there needs to be checks and balances. And I think that that's kind of the intent of my bill, to send that message. Right now, even if we objected to something that he did, we wouldn't be able to stop it unless we propose legislation.
Hubert says as representatives of the people of Kansas, lawmakers should have more input into what requirements are being expected of parents of Kansas students. However, healthcare providers feel differently.
These diseases that we now kind of forget about because we've been vaccinating against them so long, they're life-altering. Some of them are deadly.
Kansas pediatrician and vaccine researcher Randy Schumacher says decisions on what vaccinations are required should not involve lawmakers.
The best people to be able to tell whether kids need this vaccine or not are the public health officials, the people at KDHE, and it's going to be taking that away from them.
Hubert says his bill includes provisions for emergencies where the KDHE secretary would not need permission from the legislature. And the hearing included testimony from both sides of the issue, but no decisions on the bill were made. At the Capitol, I'm Corinne Griffith.
Now, when I spoke with Hubert about this bill right after the hearing, he said his big purpose was to get people talking about who should have the final say. But there was a lot of very emotional testimony at this hearing. Does it surprise you that much that so many people on both sides of the issue are so emotional about vaccines?
To me, no, it doesn't surprise me at all. Any difficulty or death of a child is incredibly difficult, and it's a tragedy. I know that I'm not a doctor, nor am I going to come up with any kind of medical opinion. So I'll listen to whatever testimony's out there and give it the weight it deserves. I do know, I was just at a Kansas cemetery last week, and those deaths in Kansas in the early 1900s of those lifespans that were 6, 7, 8 years old. And I don't think there's a family tree in Kansas that hasn't been affected by some kind of epidemic. So I will leave this in the hands of the professionals, because again, they're liable for the advice they give as well. So, and that's where I'll leave it.
Stephen?
I get probably 2 or 3 emails a week over this very issue, because really we're talking about something that's very important, our children's health, but it's also something where there's mounting evidence that is beginning to come out showing some of the negative consequences of some of these vaccines. So there are people out there that have a moral reason why not, or even a religious reason why not. And at the end of the day, I give pause to say, as a parent, it is my responsibility to take care of my child. If I feel like the risk of a vaccine is too extreme, then in essence, the only one I'm affecting is myself and my child, because if other people around them have the vaccine, then they should be fine.
Except the argument is that if there are too many who make that decision, you don't have the herd immunity left, that people around them protecting them. And that's a lot of what we heard in that hearing.
Valid, yeah. And that's a valid point. But again, I'm hesitant to say that when we've went from 20 vaccines 30 years ago and now we're at 60 or 80, that we should continue to force these upon people.
All right, and we're going to have to leave it right there. Thank you three so much. I appreciate you being here. We also want to thank our news partners at KSN, Cake, and the Wichita Eagle for sharing their materials with us. For now, have a great week.
Happy